Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. As the dust settles from testing, Lewis Hamilton has given a very optimistic appraisal of his upcoming season with Ferrari. There is a serious belief that Ferrari will be major contenders this season. That comes from not just the times on track over the last couple of days, but also from other factors behind the scenes for Hamilton and for Leclerc. But if you ask people in the know behind the scenes and what the teams believe going into Melbourne, there is no doubt Mercedes are still the heavy championship favourites. Why exactly this is the case, we'll dive into in the coming minutes. Very much interested in your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you are new, as always. I greatly appreciate it. We are going to start with Aston Martin. There was a couple of things happening. Bernie Collins said that there was actually like a heated conversation, heated discussion. It got pretty spicy behind the scenes with either Alonso, the Aston Martin staff, people at Honda. If you ask the boys at Honda what's going on, they will say one thing for certain is that we're all looking for answers. So great, we've got that level of certainty in Silverstone, in Sakura and at Milton Keynes. They're all trying to find solutions to these problems. Adrian Newey apparently told the F1 Commission it's cooked. The Honda power unit is terrible with the effect of, so these engines, the ICE has 400 kilowatts to deploy, roughly like 560 odd horsepower, something in that kind of ballpark. The kilowatts of the battery is 350, but of course it gets recharged and that's the amount that it can theoretically deploy as power. Apparently the Honda engine only gets to 250, or it might not even get there. And yeah, that's a bit of an issue, right? Because that's leaving 100 plus horses on the table at times, and well, it's obviously contributing to what is a significant disadvantage right now. There is a feeling that the Aston Martin package, the chassis, genuinely might be really good, and frankly it's still very interesting, but we don't know, they don't even know what that looks like because they don't have the chance to really test it because they're dealing with a power unit which is shambolic. This is not something that will be resolved overnight. There will be serious conversations happening behind the scenes. It's a major issue. Again, will they make changes to the rules that could even make this slightly better for Aston? Possibly, because there is talk about during a race condition going away from the 350 kilowatts of the battery. So you can't use all that power. You can only use 200 or 250 or maybe 300 of the power output the energy might be able to deploy. Now, in qualifying, it will stay 350, but the argument effectively is, what if we reduce the horsepower of the engines during the Grand Prix, so we have to do less recharge, less lift and coast, it would be better to drive. There might be something in that. I wouldn't be massively shocked to see changes made. Based on what we saw in Bahrain, it didn't, by the end of the weekend, seem too bad. But you've got to recognise, Bahrain is a pretty good track in terms of harvesting energy, right? You've got a major braking zone at the end of turn 1. You've got quite a few major braking zones throughout the lap where recharge is possible. Other tracks are not like that. Australia is one. The back curvy straight into the chicane into another straight is hell for energy deployment. But and there's not too many opportunities to recover around Australia. There's not that much braking into turn 1. There's good braking into turn 3, and then good braking at the end of the second sector. But that's about it in terms of recharge opportunities. So I think these batteries are going to be in for a wild ride. And based on Bahrain, by the end of the 6 days, I didn't think things were too bad compared to the real doom and gloom scenarios that we saw and we heard on day 1. I think by the end of the 6 days, the teams had made progress. There was talk that based on just the way that they deploy the energy, the teams were gaining half a second in lap time just on deploying it more smartly. That's knowledge that Aston Martin do not yet have, even if they have the ability to deploy that amount of energy. But Tombazis from the FIA says, we're not going to change the MGUK, like deployments, the recharge, you know, it's going to reach 350 kilowatts. That is what it is. We're not going to change that. There are other solutions. We'll see what time says on that one, because as I say, based on Australia, maybe China, maybe other circuits that are more challenging on recovery, Monza, Baku, you know, these are going to be challenges. Of course, there's more recovery opportunities at those tracks, you could argue, but there's also a lot of battery that needs deploying at those tracks. The other conversation is around the start procedure. So the Ferrari powered cars seems to have, to the eye and presumably to the numbers, although that will be disputed in a second, the best starts of anyone. Now, what they are doing is when the teams line up on the grid, the green flag is waved, they're giving it another 5 seconds, and the race said that they might actually put that down to 4 seconds because it's been slightly better than expected, and maybe at some point it can disappear entirely. The teams really get to grips of it. The other update is that they will not be using straight line mode off the line. That will be deactivated until the first straight line mode. I don't know if they're going to deactivate it entirely, as in we're going to get active aero disabled for the first 2 laps or for the first 1 lap, as was the case with DRS. I don't think so. I think it's deactivated until turn 1. After that, it's free game. That's how it currently seems. But after some complaints from McLaren especially and from Mercedes about an unsafe start procedure, again, are Mercedes playing the political game? Probably. We're going to talk about it with regard to the engine. George Russell said, "Whoa, those starts I had were the worst that I've ever had in Formula 1. Uh-oh, unsafe or whatever." I don't think George said that especially, but it does feel that there have been some attempts here to politic the rules. Ferrari will say, look, we designed our engines and our turbocharger to prepare for this scenario, and even with it, it still felt like they had something of an advantage. But maybe not, as we'll discuss in a second. Just one final thing on Aston Martin. If you guys have a spare £600,000 lying around, you can buy the Aston Martin Vantage safety car. Presumably it's not already been sold. That was on track famously in the finale of Abu Dhabi 2021. So that is probably the most reliable Aston Martin car that they've currently got going on a Formula 1 circuit. Now, Red Bull are believed to have been surprised by their own engine performance. And Red Bull, it is very difficult to place. I still think there's a world where Max and Red Bull come out and are incredibly competitive, if not winning the first race, but they don't appear to be favourites. Despite all of Mercedes' words on their energy deployment and all this, it would just be such a shock, right? It would be absolutely embarrassing, as Horner said, for Mercedes, if all of a sudden Red Bull come out the gate with the best power unit, especially on the energy recovery side, where Mercedes, we think, lobbied the FIA to make some decisions that favoured them when it comes to recovery after a difficult few years. Ferrari, however, they had a great test. Last year was a disastrous test for Ferrari. They had a really hard time with the SF25. They were struggling to put laps together. The race runs looked pretty shambolic. This year, pretty much from top to bottom, it was a very clean test. The reliability looked strong. The package itself looks impressive. There's talk about the, strong under braking, which will be especially good for Lewis Hamilton, and at corner entry. Some questions about the traction, but to be honest, I thought watching Charles Leclerc come out of turn 10 on the final couple of days, the traction looked pretty solid to me. Fred Vasseur says, the teams are sandbagging, right? There is performance being left on the table. Ferrari say that we've also got performance up our sleeve as well. There is a feeling that they were closer to their performance ceiling than some others. But how close, we don't have the answers yet. What we do have is some commentary from Lewis Hamilton. And so look, we know that a confident Lewis Hamilton is a fast Lewis Hamilton, and last year, for the last couple of years, he's been struggling with that to an extent. Part of it was the car, part of it was his own individual performance, and look, I'm hoping that Hamilton will keep this mentality as the season goes on because, he's a better driver for it, and he's a more exciting racer on the track for it as well. And, I think that Hamilton and Ferrari, most people would at least like to see something succeed out of that partnership, right? A race win or two at the very least. Hamilton says, that's a wrap on testing. It's inspiring to watch a team pull out all the stops to build a car. It's the most fascinating part of this job for me. Everything is built from scratch and designed and redesigned over and over. And then there are only a few of us who get to actually put that machine to the test. That feeling never gets old. Want to say a huge thank you to everyone back at the factory. So, Hamilton's back, baby, for all the hard work to get to this point. Truly grateful. Love this job so much, and I love working with my team and driving for the fans. I'm incredibly lucky to be able to do what I do, and I'm excited for the season ahead. This was the money point though, really. I'm reset and refreshed. I'm not going anywhere, so stick with me. For a moment, I forgot who I was, but thanks to you and your support, I'm not going to see, or you're not going to see that mindset again. I know what needs to be done. This is going to be one hell of a season. I've given everything to be here today. Let's go team, he says. So, look, strong words from Hamilton for sure. We saw him, these interviews last year. It was like, I'm past it. I'm not good enough anymore. They should just drop me and bring in Ollie Behrman, or, the implications that he gave. But clearly there's a lot more optimism, not only that he fits these cars, I think that's the key point. Hamilton last year wasn't getting along so well with that car, and really the entirety of the ground effect era. It feels like he's made a better friendship with the SF26 already. There are some characteristics of the car that seem to suit him better. He literally said his DNA is in the car when quizzed on it a couple of days ago. And now he says, don't worry about seeing me in that kind of downside. And look, I'm sure that Hamilton will have a bad qualifying at some point and he'll still be wearing his heart on his sleeve, but he's not suggesting that that's going to be a regular occurrence. That, he's like, you're not going to see that mindset again. I know who I am, right? All this. But yeah, the line of this is going to be one hell of a season indicates serious confidence of the package that Ferrari have put together and that Hamilton believes he's well positioned to exploit it. So yes, this is good news for Ferrari. But again, we don't know where the rivals are. Clearly, Ferrari have a competitive package. The question is, do their rivals have a more competitive package? And that is where the conversation then turns to Mercedes, and especially Mercedes power, because given this compression ratio drama, there is a feeling that Mercedes have possibly an extra 15 horsepower than their rivals. That's a big deal, not just in the internal combustion engine, but also because that enhances the recharge you're able to get from the battery. Now, there was apparently data seen by BBC Sport that showed that on average, the Mercedes cars had the best starts, followed by the Ferrari powered. Again, I've not seen this data. I don't know what that really looks like. I think it was quite clear that the best starts we saw individually went to Hamilton, Behrman, among some others. But I guess maybe when you consider the Cadillacs, they maybe weren't as strong, and when you consider on average the Mercedes teams were probably okay. I don't know. I didn't see enough to suggest that this felt true from the eye test, but maybe Mercedes were holding back. You never know. These starts weren't that serious. Possible that to be fair, I saw George Russell have a massive wheel spin moment off the line, so I don't really think they were massively holding back. But there's an argument that Hamilton's probably not just going to go from P9 to P1 in about 200 meters down the straight, right? And there is talk that there's other advantages soon to be realised. Now, McLaren, we don't really know where to put them right now. They looked very competitive on the final couple of days. There is a feeling that as much as they will be in the mix, they're not going to be where Mercedes should be. That seems relatively clear. The integration of these brand new power units with the new chassis regs, it was expected that the works teams would have an advantage, but McLaren are the reigning champions. They're in the mix for sure. Zach Brown says we're definitely in the top 4. Where we are, that's a big question right now. There is a feeling that things will be very track specific, but also that McLaren were using and testing an older specification Mercedes engine. So they're able to homologate different versions as time goes on. And it looks like Mercedes were using the latest version of their engine. McLaren had an older spec. Now it's mandated that they have to use the same spec as Mercedes, right? There's no ability for Mercedes to have a superior version anymore. So McLaren will be getting an engine upgrade going into Australia. That is the feeling. That could be an edge. But again, look, what extra horsepower is that going to give them? Maybe a few. But were Mercedes running at the limit? Were McLaren running slightly closer to the limit of their other engine? We just don't know the answers to these questions. What we do know is that there's been lots of controversy about Mercedes compression ratio. What's remarkable about this is that in a few days' time, they're going to vote on changing to the rules. The proposition from the FIA, in agreement with the teams, is that they will change the test for the compression ratio of the engines from cold ambient temperatures to both cold and hot temperatures. Now, initially, some manufacturers wanted to go for a hot-only test. That would mean that it's funny, isn't it, these Formula 1 teams, because they're like, oh, Mercedes are cheating, stop them, we've got to stop them by changing the rules. But of course, the way that they want to change the rules is so that they can then cheat, and it will be easier for them to do so because Mercedes have spent all this time finding a loophole for the cold test, and now you're going to make it a hot test, so that gives the other teams the chance to try and find a similar trick in that set of circumstances, right? Maybe the argument is just to say, look lads, 18-1 is fine again. If you want to do 18-1, maybe in future years, I don't know if they're going to change it for next year, but you know what I'm saying? Because it used to be 18-1, this wasn't a conversation, because going above 18-1 was so tricky and introduced so many issues and knocking in the engine and problems like this that teams didn't really try. They were like, you know what, 18-1, I'm happy with that. 16-1 leaves the door open, so it's causing all this drama. But Mercedes have said, look, we're not going to change your hard-only test. Let's just test in both conditions. How about we do that instead? But the other teams are maybe thinking now, well, what if Mercedes are able to adapt their engine, or if it's already fine, so it passes both of these tests? Because hot is not running. So like that is different. And there is a feeling that Mercedes can already pass these tests. So the question for the other teams is, could this backfire? Like, by writing this new test into the regulations, they might even be baking in Mercedes' advantage. So it's not at all clear that this is going to be advantageous to the rivals. It's not at all clear that even if this goes ahead, then Mercedes will turn up at the start of August with the new changes in place when this is going to come through into Force 4. With a very much depleted power unit. The feeling is that if anything, it's probably not going to make much difference. And as a result of that, Mercedes are still considered the favourites for the season. George, Kimi, Andrew Chauvelin, they were pretty high in their praise for the car. The car was, of all the cars in testing, the most consistent by quite some way in the long run pace. The consistency of the laps they were able to put together was very, very impressive. The other cars, even the Ferrari that was competitive, they weren't able to get quite where Mercedes were over the last few days. We don't know how much engine performance they were hiding. Max Verstappen believes it's a lot, right? Max said when Mercedes were waxing lyrical about Red Bull's engine being the best that, look, wait for Australia, buddy. You're going to see how much power that Mercedes really has. And I do think there's been a very political game here happening where Mercedes have been trying to shut down lots of the conversation. They had a pretty anonymous first test, and then once the conversation starts to fizzle out a little bit more and the conversation turns towards Ferrari, they quite quietly had a really good last couple of days. I still think Mercedes have quite a lot yet to show us, and look, if Mercedes are going to say, wow, that Red Bull electrical deployment is crazy, I have a pretty hard time believing theirs isn't at least in a pretty similar ballpark. So there's good reason to fear Mercedes, especially when the race understands that despite a very good start to the season from Ferrari, the race understands that Mercedes still has significant pace in hand, and it will head to the season opening race in a fortnight as the pre-race favourite. So there is no doubt Mercedes is still considered the favourite. These are actually the updated title odds. This is over the last week or so to see how things have changed. Hamilton and Leclerc's chances have gone up quite dramatically in recent days. George remains the favourite. In terms of the overall championship for the constructors, I've eliminated those that are like 1% or less here, so it's the same story in this graphic. But Ferrari have moved up. They're now considered more likely than McLaren to win, which to be fair I would agree with, right? Like, I think if a Mercedes-powered team is going to win, it's going to be Mercedes. I'd be surprised if it isn't. I think it's possible that Red Bull or Ferrari could win. Aston at 2% feels ambitious, to say the very least right now. But that is where it stands, and it's also echoed by what Craig Slater put together. So the guys at Sky Sports, they spoke to a number of paddock insiders. This is what they came up with. Now again, this might not be accurate. This is based on what the teams think of other teams. The teams believe Mercedes have performance they're holding back. That is a belief. How much that is based on fact, we don't really know. Mercedes will say, oh, not at all. We didn't have much to show. But I will say they didn't do a race simulation. They could have done. They did it in the first week. And their first race simulation that Antonelli did, I think, and maybe Russell as well, I think they both did one, in the first weekend of testing, was quicker than anybody else, until Ferrari came along and did a very competitive one as well. But in terms of equal conditions, Mercedes felt like the benchmark in the test in the first weekend, even though it wasn't a clean first week of testing. Second week, they didn't even bother. So the question is, was that because of an issue, or far more likely, they don't want to show where they really are in terms of a full race simulation? So Mercedes decided to hold that one back. Now, what's interesting here is McLaren's second. I guess there's a feeling that McLaren are very competitive, that they have a very strong engine that is set to get an upgrade, and that is going to be enough to tip them over Ferrari. But look, this is a list from 1 to 11 actually, of course, because Aston Martin in here as well at number 11. but we believe there is a gap here, right? I think some words for Audi as well. You know, given they've got a brand new power unit, for them to be ahead of Williams as it stands and in the conversation, to me is pretty impressive. Like, I know that it is effectively Sauber, but we know what Honda are cooking up with their power unit, right? So, and obviously Audi have a deep and very successful history in motorsport. So them building an engine for them is no crazy task, I imagine. But still, I think it's pretty impressive that Audi are considered to be in the mix before the start of the season. Nate Saunders says this. So this is his ranking based on what he's heard. F1 writer for ESPN. Mercedes, Ferrari, McLaren, Red Bull, Alpine, Haas, Audi, Racing Bulls, Williams. So slightly different to what we've seen from Sky Sports, but not massively different. It's the same top four, slightly different order. They've got Alpine leading the pack, whereas Craig Slater had Haas. Actually, no, they also had Alpine, didn't they? Yeah. So Alpine also considered to be the pack leaders. Then Haas in 6th. Then there's a little bit of debate on 7, 8, 9, but 10 and 11 are pretty justified where they are, it seems. So, yes, very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Apologies for the slightly later video than normal, but I'm back at it again tomorrow with any luck. So hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.